Danielle Harris, a 42-year-old black woman, was someone who commanded respect without asking for it. Her career as a top-tier lawyer had earned her a reputation in the legal world, but she never flaunted her success. To those who didn't know her, she looked like any other hard-working professional going about her day. Today was no different. She had just finished a long day of meetings and court appearances, and the last thing on her mind was drawing attention. Danielle drove a modest but reliable car, a practical choice for someone who preferred to stay under the radar. No flashy cars or designer bags, just a woman focused on her work and her clients. It was late in the evening when Danielle pulled into a gas station just outside the city. The sun had already set, leaving the sky a muted shade of purple. The fluorescent lights of the gas station flickered overhead as she stepped out of her car to fill the tank. She was dressed simply in a tailored blazer and jeans, nothing too fancy, just comfortable enough after a long day. Her hair was neatly tied back, and she moved with the kind of confidence that comes from years of navigating high-pressure environments. To anyone watching, she was just another woman filling up her car after a day at work. But someone was watching. Officer Brent Stevens sat in his patrol car across the street, parked just out of sight but close enough to observe the scene. Stevens was young, still in his early 30s, with a face that always seemed to be set in a scowl. His eyes scanned the gas station with a suspicion that had become second nature to him. He'd been on the force for almost a decade, and in that time he'd developed a deep-seated prejudice that he wasn't even aware of, or maybe he was, but it didn't matter to him. To Brent, certain people just didn't belong in certain places, and he had made it his personal mission to remind them of that. As he watched Danielle, something about her made him pause. She was black, she was driving a nice car, and in Brent's mind, that was enough to warrant suspicion. His hand hovered over the door handle, debating whether he should intervene. Maybe she didn't belong in this part of town. Maybe that car wasn't hers. Maybe there was something going on. He didn't have any concrete reason to stop her, but in Brent's world, he didn't always need one. His gut feeling was often enough. Danielle finished pumping the gas, replaced the nozzle, and was about to head inside to pay when she noticed the patrol car slowly pulling into the station. Her heart sank just a little, not because she'd done anything wrong, but because she'd been here before. It was a familiar feeling for many black people, the sudden realization that an ordinary situation was about to become complicated, all because of someone else's prejudice. She sighed and steeled herself, hoping it was just a coincidence, but knowing deep down that it probably wasn't. Stevens pulled up behind her car and got out of the cruiser with deliberate slowness, like a predator circling its prey. He adjusted his belt, his hand resting casually near his holster as he approached her. Danielle noticed the stance immediately. It was one she had seen many times in court, the posture of a man who believed he held all the power in the world. She kept her composure, her lawyer instincts kicking in, reminding her to stay calm and collected no matter what happened next. "Good evening, ma'am," Stephen said, his voice tight and clipped. "Can I see your driver's license and registration, please?" Danielle raised an eyebrow, her mind racing. She knew this drill. She had seen it play out countless times with her clients, and now it was happening to her. There was no traffic violation, no reason for him to be stopping her except for the fact that she didn't look right to him. But she had learned long ago that arguing at this stage never helped. So without a word, she reached into her purse and pulled out her license, handing it to him calmly. "Is there a problem, officer?" she asked, her voice steady but firm. Stevens didn't answer right away. He was too busy scanning her license, looking for anything at all that could give him a reason to escalate this. When he found nothing, his gaze shifted to her car, as if the vehicle itself could somehow betray her. He glanced back at her, narrowing his eyes. "This your car?" he asked, his tone laced with suspicion. Danielle's lips tightened. Of course it was her car and he knew that, but this was part of the game. He wanted her to justify her existence, to prove that she had a right to be here, in this neighborhood, in this car. Yes, it is, she replied, keeping her voice measured. Stevens tilted his head, clearly unsatisfied. Mind stepping out of the vehicle for me? Her chest tightened slightly but outwardly. Danielle remained composed. She could already see where this was going. It didn't matter that she had done nothing wrong. She knew that refusing would only escalate things, but she also knew that complying wouldn't necessarily keep her safe either. But this wasn't about legality, it was about control. I'd like to know why I'm being asked to step out of my vehicle, she said, carefully choosing each word. Stevens's jaw clenched. He wasn't used to being questioned, especially not by someone like her. I need to run a quick check. Just step out of the car, ma'am. Danielle took a deep breath. There was no point in resisting. Not here, not now. She slowly opened the door and stepped out, standing tall despite the sinking feeling in her stomach. As a lawyer, she had spent years defending people from exactly this kind of harassment, and now she was living it. She was no stranger to racism, but experiencing it firsthand like this never got easier. Stevens began walking around her car, peering into the windows like he expected to find something illegal. The tension between them was palpable, hanging heavy in the cool night air. Daniel could feel the weight of his scrutiny, his unspoken judgment. She had done nothing wrong, yet here she was, standing outside her own car, being treated like a suspect. What's this? Stevens asked suddenly, stopping near the back of the car. He reached down and picked up something from inside the trunk. Danielle's brow furrowed. She hadn't noticed anything out of place, but Stevens held up a small leather pouch, shaking it slightly as if to emphasize its importance. Her stomach dropped. That was hers, a gift from a colleague after a successful case. It was completely innocuous, but she knew how this would look to someone like Stevens. He would take anything and twist it to fit his narrative. Yes, I'm going to need you to explain this, Stevens said, his voice dripping with false concern. Danielle crossed her arms, feeling her patience wane. That's a personal item, officer. It has nothing to do with anything illegal. Stevens wasn't listening. He was already writing his story, crafting the scene in his head where he, the railway officer, had uncovered something suspicious. Danielle could see it in his eyes, the need to be right, to assert his dominance over her. Stevens stood there, holding the small leather pouch as if it was some sort of smoking gun. His eyes darted from the pouch back to Danielle, clearly trying to make sense of how he could escalate this situation further. The tension between them thickened, the air growing heavier with each passing moment. For Danielle, it was the moment she always dreaded, the moment where the underlying prejudice in someone's eyes became undeniable. She had seen this play out before, too many times. A simple stop turning into something much more dangerous, all because of the assumptions being made about her based solely on the color of her skin. Danielle straightened her back and let out a controlled breath. That's a gift from a colleague, she said evenly, keeping her voice measured. It's a personal item, nothing illegal. Stevens ignored her, his focus still on the pouch. He didn't need to say it, but Danielle could tell exactly what he was thinking. Why would someone like her have something like this? The unspoken accusation hung in the air, and for a moment it felt like they were both waiting for the other to make the next move. The silence was unbearable, the only sound the faint hum of traffic in the distance, and the occasional ping of the gas station's intercom. I'm going to need to take a closer look at this, Stevens said, his voice dripping with suspicion. Danielle clenched her fists at her sides, but kept her face neutral. Officer, I've complied with everything you've asked so far. I've given you my license, my registration, and I've explained what that item is. And I'm asking you now, what exactly is the problem here? Stevens, undeterred, continued, "Ma'am, I need you to step back from the vehicle. This is for your safety." Sigh. "My safety?" Danielle asked, unable to hide the incredulity in her voice. "I'm the one who's in danger here, officer. Let's not pretend that I don't know how this works." Stevens' jaw tightened. He wasn't used to being challenged, especially not by a black woman who, in his mind, didn't belong in this nice car, in this nice neighborhood. She was supposed to be scared, compliant, maybe even submissive, anything but confident and assertive. That's what made this so much worse for him. The fact that she was standing her ground, that she wasn't giving him the satisfaction of seeing her break, infuriated him. "You're making this more difficult than it needs to be," he said through gritted teeth. "If you cooperate, we can resolve this quickly." "I am cooperating," Danielle said sharply, her patience wearing thin. "But I'm also fully aware of my rights. And what you're doing right now, this isn't procedure. You have no reason to keep me here, officer. I've done nothing wrong." Stephen's eyes narrowed. He took a step closer to her, closing the distance between them. "I'll decide what's procedure here," he snapped, his hand brushing the grip of his holstered gun. Danielle's heart raced, but she refused to let fear show on her face. She had been in high-pressure situations before, courtrooms where lives were on the line, meetings with top officials where decisions carried massive consequences. This was different, though. This wasn't about the law. This was about power, and she knew it. The stakes here weren't just her dignity or her pride. This was about her safety. She could feel the shift in Stephen's demeanor, the way he puffed out his chest, the way his hand hovered too close to his weapon. "Step back," Stevens repeated, this time with a hint of threat in his voice. Danielle did as he asked, not because she believed he had the right, but because she knew where this could go if she didn't. Every instinct in her told her to de-escalate, to stay calm, to get out of this situation without giving him any excuse to take things further. But at the same time, she couldn't ignore the blatant injustice of what was happening. She took a step back, hands by her sides, and watched as Stevens opened the pouch, rifling through it with deliberate slowness. He was looking for something, anything, that would justify his suspicions. But there was nothing. The pouch contained only what she said it did, a small keepsake, some personal items, nothing remotely illegal or dangerous. Stephen's frustration was palpable. He closed the pouch and tossed it back into the trunk with an air of finality, as if to say that this wasn't over. He wasn't done with her yet. "Why don't you tell me where you got this?" he asked, his voice low and accusing. Danielle's patience was nearly gone. "I already told you, it's a gift from a colleague," she replied, her tone clipped. "There's nothing illegal about it." "Do you have proof of that?" he shot back. "Proof?" The absurdity of the question made Danielle's head spin. Proof? Did he really expect her to carry around proof for every single item she owned? She felt her body tense, the anger simmering just beneath the surface. But she knew better than to let it show. "I don't need to prove anything to you, officer," she said slowly, enunciating each word. "I've done nothing wrong. You're detaining me without cause, and I will be filing a complaint about this." For a split second, Stevens hesitated. He knew she was right, but his ego, his prejudice wouldn't allow him to back down, for he couldn't let her walk away without consequence. Not after she'd dared to challenge him like this. "You can file whatever complaint you want," he sneered. "But right now you're under suspicion of possession of stolen property." Danielle felt the blood drain from her face. Stolen property. He was really going to take it that far. She had done nothing to provoke this kind of treatment, but it didn't matter. Stevens had already made up his mind. She was guilty in his eyes simply because she was black, driving a nice car, and standing in a place where, in his mind, she didn't belong. Before she could say anything more, Stevens stepped forward, grabbed her by the arm, and began roughly pulling her towards the police cruiser. The suddenness of his action shocked her, and for a moment she didn't know how to react. Her mind was spinning, trying to process the fact that this was actually happening. She was being arrested. For what? For being black in the wrong place at the wrong time. "Officer, you're making a mistake," Danielle shouted, her voice filled with both anger and disbelief. "This is completely unnecessary." But Stevens wasn't listening. He had already made up his mind. He shoved her into the back of the cruiser, the cold metal of the handcuffs digging into her wrists. The humiliation of the moment was overwhelming, but Danielle refused to break. She wouldn't give him the satisfaction. As she sat in the back of the police car, the realization of what was happening began to fully sink in. She wasn't just another woman being harassed by a racist cop. She was Danielle Harris, a respected lawyer with powerful connections, and there was one person she knew she could call who could fix this immediately. Her husband. Danielle shifted slightly, feeling the small hidden phone in her pocket. It wasn't her main phone. Stevens had already taken that from her, but she always carried a backup for emergencies, and this was certainly an emergency. She wasn't about to let this go quietly. With her hands cuffed behind her, she fumbled awkwardly for the phone, managing to press the buttons just right to make the call. The line rang once, twice, then connected. "Danielle?" Her husband's voice came through, filled with concern. "George," she whispered, her voice trained with both anger and fear. "I've been arrested. I need you to call the police department now." Danielle sat in the back of the police cruiser, her hands still cuffed behind her back, trying to keep her breathing steady. It was a surreal moment, one she had witnessed too many times from her clients, but never thought she'd experience herself. The cool metal of the handcuffs dug into her skin, adding a dull pain to the mix of emotions swirling inside her. Rage, humiliation, fear, but above all, determination. She wasn't going to let this slide. Not this time. Not her. The phone call to her husband had been short, her voice low enough so that Stevens wouldn't hear. George, her husband, had been calm, but she knew the storm was coming. He was always composed under pressure. It was one of the things she admired most about him. As one of the most well-respected lawyers in the city, George had dealt with situations like this before, only they had never involved his own wife. The fact that he now had a personal stake in this made Danielle certain that things were about to get very complicated, says Stevens. The minutes ticked by as Stevens stood outside, talking to someone on his radio. His back was turned to her, but she could still sense the smugness radiating off of him. He thought he had won, that he had successfully asserted his dominance over her. He was wrong. "Antapi." Danielle tried to adjust her position, the cuffs cutting into her wrists, but it was impossible to get comfortable. The gas station, now seemingly frozen in time, felt like a stage where this whole scene was playing out. Customers were still coming and going, but most of them were now glancing in her direction, probably wondering what she had done to deserve being handcuffed by police in his police car. She knew that look all too well the assumption of guilt that came just from seeing her in this position, and of course, from seeing that she was a black woman. Suddenly, Stevens' voice cut through the quiet of the night. "Dispatch, this is Officer Stevens. I'm bringing in a suspect. I need backup at the station." Danielle's heart raced. Bringing her in. For what? He had found nothing. No stolen property, no illegal substances, nothing that could possibly justify what he was doing. This was a power play, pure and simple. He wanted to show her that he was in charge, that he could do whatever he wanted, and there was nothing she could do about it. But he didn't know who he was dealing with. Not yet. Just then, Stevens opened the driver's side door and slid into the seat. He glanced at Danielle through the rearview mirror, his expression unreadable but laced with an air of superiority. "We're going to the station," he said flatly, as if it were the most natural thing in the world. Danielle swallowed her anger, knowing that at anything she said now would only fuel his desire to control the situation. But she couldn't let him take her in without a fight. She wasn't going to sit quietly while he dragged her through the system for no reason other than his own prejudice. "You have no grounds to arrest me," she said, her voice sharp but controlled. "I've cooperated with everything you've asked, and you've found nothing. This is illegal." Stevens smirked, his eyes still focused on the road ahead. "You're in no position to tell me what's legal and what's not," he replied. "You think you know the law just because you've got a degree. You think that gives you a pass." Danielle clenched her jaw. She wasn't just any lawyer, and soon enough he'd find that out. "I'm not asking for a pass," she said coldly. "I'm asking for my rights to be respected, but apparently that's too much for you." Stephen's smirk faded, his grip tightening on the steering wheel. "You know, you people are always pulling that rights card, like you're being oppressed or something. Well, guess what? That doesn't fly with me. You're just like anyone else I've stopped. Doesn't matter if you're a lawyer or not."
Danielle's stomach churned. She had heard it all before, but hearing it directly from the mouth of the man who had her in custody, the man who was supposed to uphold the law, made it hit differently. You people. It was always there, just under the surface, waiting to be unleashed when someone like Stevens felt threatened or challenged.
Silence filled the car again as they drove, the weight of his words settling between them. Danielle's mind was racing, but she kept her composure. She knew her husband was making calls, pulling strings, doing everything in his power to stop this madness. But until then, she had to hold on. After what felt like an eternity, they arrived at the station. Stevens pulled into the lot and parked, then got out of the car without a word. A few seconds later, he opened the back door, pulling Danielle out by the arm. The fluorescent lights of the station illuminated the scene, and she could see the other officers inside, some of whom had already noticed them. So Danielle stumbled slightly as she was pulled forward, her wrists aching from the tightness of the cuffs. But she kept her head high, refusing to let him see her break. She wasn't going to give him that satisfaction. As they approached the entrance to the station, another officer, one she hadn't seen before, stepped out. He was tall, with salt and pepper hair, and looked to be in his 50s. His eyes scanned the scene, landing on Danielle and then on Stevens. "What's going on here?" the older officer asked, his tone stern but measured. "Got a suspect," Stevens replied curtly, still gripping Danielle's arm. "Caught her with some suspicious property at a gas station. She resisted, so I brought her in." Danielle's mouth fell open slightly. Resisted? She had done nothing of the sort. But she had learned long ago that people like Stevens never told the whole truth when it suited them. She bit her tongue, waiting for the right moment to speak. The older officer's gaze lingered on Danielle for a moment longer before he turned back to Stevens. "I see. Mind telling me what exactly this suspicious property is?" Stevens shifted uncomfortably. "It's a leather pouch. Looked expensive, and she couldn't give me a straight answer about where she got it." The older officer raised an eyebrow. "A leather pouch?" He looked back at Danielle, his expression softening slightly. "Mom, can you explain what's going on?" Danielle didn't hesitate. "That's a personal item, a gift from a colleague. There's nothing illegal about it, and I've complied with everything Officer Stevens has asked. I'm a lawyer, and I know my rights. This arrest is illegal." The older officer's eyes widened slightly, the word lawyer clearly catching his attention. He glanced at Stevens, who was now looking increasingly uncomfortable. "She's a lawyer." Stevens shrugged, his nonchalance barely masking the frustration bubbling beneath the surface. That's what she says. The older officer sighed, rubbing a hand over his face. Stevens, did you run her ID? Did you check the vehicle registration? Did you actually find anything illegal? Stevens hesitated, and that pause was enough to tell Danielle everything she needed to know. He hadn't. He had nothing. He had made this entire situation up in his head because he didn't like the fact that she was a successful black woman in a nice car in a nice neighborhood, and he needed to prove something to himself. To her. Sir, I ran the ID, but I haven't checked the car thoroughly yet, Stevens muttered, clearly trying to save face. The older officer shot him a look of disbelief. You haven't checked the car thoroughly, but you arrested her. Danielle's heart raced, her pulse pounding in her ears. This was it. This was the moment when the tide would turn. She had been patient, calm, and now, finally, someone was questioning Stevens' actions, someone with authority. But look, Stevens began, his voice rising slightly. She was acting suspicious. I had every reason to believe. No, you didn't, the older officer interrupted, his voice firm. You arrested her without cause, Stevens. You know better than this. Stevens clenched his fists, his face flushing red. I was doing my job. Your job, the older officer said slowly, is to protect and serve, not harass people because you think they don't belong. Danielle felt a wave of relief wash over her. She had been right to hold on, to trust that someone would see through Stevens' lies, that the situation wasn't over yet. The older officer turned to her, his expression apologetic. I'm sorry for what's happened here, ma'am. We're going to get this sorted out right now. Stevens took a step forward, his face twisted in anger. You can't just. I can and I will, the older officer snapped. You've gone too far this time, Stevens. You've crossed a line. Just as the older officer was about to reach for his radio to call in the situation, the station doors swung open, and Danielle's heart skipped a beat. Standing there, with a look of cold fury on his face, was George Harris, her husband. He didn't say a word as he stepped forward, his gaze locking onto Stevens like a laser. The air around them seemed to shift, the tension rising even higher. Stevens froze, his mouth hanging open slightly as he recognized George. He hadn't expected this. He hadn't known. And now his entire world was crashing down around him. Officer Stevens, George said calmly, his voice laced with venom, you've made a very, very big mistake. The moment George Harris stepped through the doors of the station, it was as if the entire atmosphere shifted. His presence commanded immediate attention. And even though he wasn't wearing a uniform, it was clear that he carried a weight of authority far greater than anyone else in the room. His tall, broad-shouldered frame and the cold fire in his eyes sent a clear message. Someone was going to pay for what had just happened to his wife. Danielle, sitting in the holding area with her wrists still cuffed behind her back, couldn't help but feel a flicker of relief when she saw him. She had known, from the moment she made the call, that George would come for her. He always did. But seeing him here face to face with the man who had arrested her without cause gave her a renewed sense of power. She wasn't alone in this fight. She never had been. Stevens, who had been mid-sentence, sputtering excuses to the older officer, froze when he saw George walk in. The colour drained from his face as he realised the full weight of what he had done. George Harris wasn't just another lawyer. He was the lawyer, one of the most respected and feared legal minds in the entire city. He was known for taking down corrupt police departments, for winning massive lawsuits that left officers like Stevens out of a sense. And now, George Harris was here, staring him down like a predator eyeing his prey. Mr. Harris, the older officer said quickly, stepping forward to greet George with a firm handshake. I'm Officer Rick Myers. I just arrived on the scene a few moments ago. I want to apologize on behalf of the department for what's happened here. This was a mistake. A mistake, George repeated, his voice low and dangerously calm. His eyes never left Stevens, who was now visibly sweating. Is that what you're calling this? The Myers swallowed hard, clearly sensing the tension. Yes, sir. Officer Stevens acted without proper cause, and we're taking immediate steps to correct the situation. Danielle watched from her seat, her pulse quickening. She could see the inner battle playing out on George's face. On the one hand, he was a professional, a man who knew how to navigate situations like this with precision and patience. But on the other hand, this wasn't just any case. This was his wife, the woman he loved, being treated like a criminal for no reason other than the colour of skin. The anger simmered just beneath the surface, and she knew that George was doing everything in his power to keep it in check. I want my wife released. Now, George said, his voice as sharp as a knife. The Myers nodded immediately. Of course. Let me just. But before Myers could even finish his sentence, Stevens stepped forward, his face contorted with frustration. I don't care who you are, he spat, glaring at George. Your wife was acting suspiciously. She resisted arrest. I had every right to bring her in, and I'm not going to stand here and let you bully me into dropping the charges just because you've got some fancy law degree. Danielle's heart skipped a beat. This was exactly what she had feared. Stevens wasn't just wrong, he was dangerous. He was the kind of man who, when cornered, lashed out instead of backing down. And now, with his career on the line, he was going to dig in his heels even deeper. Consequences be damned. George's expression didn't change, but Danielle could see the muscle in his jaw clenching, a sign that his patience was wearing thin. You're making this worse for yourself, Officer Stevens, George said quietly. Let me give you a piece of advice. Drop this now, and maybe you'll walk away from this with your badge intact. Stevens sneered, his bravado faltering but still holding on. You think you can just walk in here and intimidate me? That's not how this works. I don't care who you are or who she is. She broke the law, and I'm going to see that justice is served. Danielle couldn't stay silent any longer. Justice, she demanded, her voice shaking with controlled fury. You mean the justice where I'm guilty just because you decided I don't belong in this neighborhood? For where you arrest me for no reason and expect me to sit quietly while you destroy my life? That kind of justice. Myers shot Stevens a warning look. Stevens enough. But Stevens ignored him, his eyes locked on Danielle. You can play the victim all you want, lady, but the fact is, I had probable cause to bring you in. If you hadn't been so damn arrogant, this could have gone a lot smoother. Danielle's breath caught in her throat. Arrogant. That word so often used against black women who dared to stand up for themselves. It was a dog whistle, a code word that really meant how dare you think you're equal. And now Stevens was using it against her, trying to paint her as the aggressor in this situation. George's voice cut through the air like a blade. Take those cuffs off of her, now. Myers didn't hesitate this time. He stepped forward, fumbling for the keys as he unlocked the handcuffs and freed Danielle's wrists. She rubbed her aching wrists, the skin red and raw from where the metal had bitten into her flesh. But she didn't flinch, didn't wince. She wouldn't give Stevens the satisfaction of seeing her in pain. Are you okay? George asked, his voice softening as he turned his attention to his wife. Danielle nodded, though the truth was more complicated. Physically, she was fine, but emotionally she was seething. She had dealt with racism her entire life, but this was different. This was a blatant abuse of power, right in front of her husband, right in front of other officers who were supposed to be on the side of justice. I'm fine, she said, though her voice was tight with anger. But I want this handled, today. George nodded, then turned back to Myers. I want to speak to the captain. Now. Myers looked uneasy but nodded. Of course, Mr. Harris. I'll get him right away. As Myers disappeared into the station to retrieve the captain, George turned back to Stevens. The two men locked eyes, and for a moment, the tension in the room was suffocating. Stevens had never looked more out of place, more desperate to regain control of a situation that was slipping through his fingers. "You're going to regret this," George said softly, but the threat was unmistakable. Stevens opened his mouth to respond, but before he could say a word, the door to the station opened again, and in walked the captain, Captain Thomas Hayes. Danielle had heard of him before. He was well respected, known for running a tight ship and not tolerating any misconduct in his department. He had a reputation for fairness, but also for being a man who didn't back down easily. "So, Mr. Harris," Captain Hayes said, extending his hand to George, "I was just informed about what's happening here. I want to personally apologize for this misunderstanding." Yo. George shook his hand, but his expression remained cold. "Misunderstanding? My wife was wrongfully arrested and humiliated. That's not a misunderstanding, Captain." Captain Hayes nodded, his face grim. "You're absolutely right. This should never have happened. I assure you, we're going to conduct a full investigation into Officer Stevens' actions." "I don't want an investigation," George replied. "I want him fired. Today." Hayes' eyes flicked towards Stevens, who was now standing rigid, his face pale. "I understand your frustration, Mr. Harris, but I can't make that decision on the spot. There's a process we have to follow." George's lips pressed into a thin line. "Process. The only process that happened tonight was my wife being arrested for no reason other than the fact that she's a black woman in a nice car. That's not a process. That's racism." Hayes didn't flinch. "I hear you, and I promise you we will take this seriously. Officer Stevens will be placed on immediate administrative leave while we conduct our investigation. If we find any evidence of misconduct, he will face the full consequences." George's eyes narrowed. "You'll find the evidence. Trust me." Danielle could see that George wasn't satisfied, but she knew that pushing too hard, too fast, wouldn't get them the resolution they wanted. There was a process, even if it was flawed, and they had to work within it, at least for now. Captain Hayes turned to Danielle, his expression softening. "Mrs. Harris, I am truly sorry for what you've been through tonight. If there's anything I can do to make this right, please let me know." Danielle's voice was steady as she replied, "What you can do is make sure this doesn't happen to anyone else, ever again." "Antane." Hayes nodded. "We'll do everything we can." As the tension in the room began to dissipate, George took Danielle's hand and they turned to leave the station. But just as they reached the door, George paused, glancing over his shoulder at Stevens. "Make no mistake," George said quietly. "This isn't over. I'll be seeing you in court." Stevens said nothing, his face ashen, as the door closed behind George and Danielle, leaving him standing there, knowing that his career, his reputation, and his future were hanging by a thread. As the door to the station closed behind George and Danielle, Officer Stevens stood rooted to the spot, his pulse pounding in his ears. His mind was racing, trying to process the disaster that had just unfolded. He had made a grave mistake, and now, with George Harris involved, that mistake was threatening to destroy everything he had worked for, his career, his reputation, his life. The tension in the room was thick. Stevens could feel the eyes of his colleagues on him, their silent judgment cutting into him like knives. He knew what they were thinking. They were wondering how it had come to this, how he could have been so reckless, that Stevens wasn't ready to accept defeat just yet. He couldn't. His pride wouldn't allow it, and there had to be a way out of this. There had to be a way to save his career. Captain Hayes, still standing by the front desk, turned to face Stevens, his expression unreadable. "Stevens, my office. Now." Stevens swallowed hard, his throat dry. He followed Hayes down the hall, the sound of their footsteps echoing through the empty corridor. They entered the captain's office, and Hayes closed the door behind them, shutting out the rest of the station. The air was heavy with tension as Hayes sat behind his desk, motioning for Stevens to take a seat. But Stevens remained standing, his hands clenched into fists at his sides. "Sit down, officer," Hayes said, his voice low but commanding. Stevens hesitated for a moment before finally sinking into the chair. His mind was a whirlwind of excuses, justifications, anything he could say to salvage the situation. But as Hayes leaned forward, his steely gaze locking onto Stevens, he knew that words wouldn't be enough this time. "What the hell were you thinking?" Hayes began, his voice cold and measured. "You just arrested the wife of one of the most powerful lawyers in the city, without cause. Do you have any idea what kind of damage you've done? To her, to this department, to yourself?" Stevens opened his mouth to speak, but Hayes held up a hand to silence him. "Don't. I don't want to hear your excuses right now. What I want to know is what led you to believe that you had the right to detain her in the first place. Did she commit a crime? Did you have any reasonable suspicion beyond the fact that she was driving a nice car in the wrong neighborhood?" Stevens' jaw tightened. The accusation stung, but he couldn't deny the truth of it. He hadn't had any real reason to arrest her. His decision had been based purely on instinct, on the belief that something about her was off. But how could he say that without admitting his own bias? "She was acting suspiciously," Stevens muttered, avoiding Hayes' gaze. "I thought." "You thought wrong," Hayes snapped, cutting him off. "This wasn't some petty traffic stop, Stevens. You arrested a black woman, a prominent lawyer, for no reason other than your own assumptions. Do you understand the gravity of this situation?" Stevens' face flushed with anger. "So what? She's untouchable because she's a lawyer, because her husband is some big shot. No, she's untouchable because she did nothing wrong," Hayes shouted, slamming his fist on the desk. "And now, thanks to your stupidity, this department is about to face a lawsuit that could destroy us." Stevens flinched at the outburst but quickly regained his composure. He wasn't going to be intimidated, not by Hayes, not by George Harris, not by anyone. "I did my job," he said through gritted teeth. "I followed procedure." Hayes stared at him in disbelief. "Procedure? Procedure? You arrested her without probable cause. You escalated a situation that didn't need escalating. And now we're all going to pay for it." Stevens felt the walls closing in around him. He had made a mistake, but admitting it now felt like a defeat too big to bear. He had to stand his ground, even if that ground was crumbling beneath his feet. "I had every right to investigate her," he insisted, his voice rising. "She was being difficult. She refused to answer my questions. She didn't owe you anything," Hayes interrupted, his voice quieter now but no less dangerous. "But you were looking for a reason to arrest her, and when you couldn't find one, you made one up. That's not policing, Stevens. That's harassment." Stevens bristled at the word. Harassment. It echoed in his mind, each syllable a jab at his pride. He wasn't a racist. He wasn't one of those cops who targeted people just because of their skin color. He had been doing his job. He had followed his gut. But deep down, he knew Hayes was right. He had let his bias cloud his judgment, and now he was paying the price. Hayes leaned back in his chair, his expression softening slightly. "Look, Stevens, I get it. You made a mistake. But this is bigger than you now. George Harris isn't going to let this slide. He's going to come after you, and when he's done, you won't have a badge to wear. You need to take responsibility for what happened. Own up to it, and maybe we can contain the damage." Stevens shook his head, his mind spinning. No, won't let him ruin me. I won't." Hayes sighed, rubbing a hand over his face. Stevens, this isn't about you anymore. This is about the department. If you keep fighting this, you're going to take all of us down with you. But Stevens wasn't listening. His mind was racing, searching for a way out, a way to turn the situation in his favor. He wasn't going to go down like this. He couldn't. Not after everything he had worked for. I need to talk to her, Stevens said suddenly, standing up from the chair. I need to talk to Danielle. Ace frowned, confused. What are you talking about? If I can talk to her, explain things, maybe we can work something out. Hayes shook his head, exasperated. Are you out of your mind? You think she's going to listen to you after what you did to her, after you humiliated her in front of her husband, in front of half the department? I can fix this, Stevens insisted, his voice desperate now. I just need to talk to her. She'll listen to me. Stevens, sit down, Hayes ordered, his tone brooking no argument. You're not going anywhere near her. But Stevens was already moving toward the door. He wasn't thinking clearly anymore. All he knew was that he had to do something, anything, to salvage the situation. He couldn't just sit back and let his life fall apart. Not without a fight. Stevens, I'm warning you, Hayes started, but Stevens was already out the door, his footsteps echoing down the hallway as he made his way back toward the holding area. Danielle sat in the small waiting room just outside the station's processing area, her wrists free now but still sore from the handcuffs. She had been talking quietly with George, trying to process everything that had happened, when the door to the room flew open and Stevens stormed in. Danielle's heart skipped a beat as she saw him, his face flushed with anger, his eyes wild. George immediately stepped in front of her, his body tense, ready to protect his wife from whatever this unhinged officer was planning. What the hell do you think you're doing? George demanded, his voice cold and sharp. Stevens ignored him, his gaze locked on Danielle. I need to talk to her. Just give me a minute. So you don't get to talk to her, George said, stepping forward. You've done enough damage. But Stevens wouldn't be deterred. He was spiraling now, his desperation driving him forward. Please just listen. I didn't mean for this to happen. I was doing my job. I just need to explain. There's nothing to explain, George snapped, his voice rising with fury. You targeted my wife because she's black. You humiliated her, you arrested her without cause, and now you want to explain? Get the hell out of here. I can. Danielle stood up slowly, placing a hand on George's arm. It's okay, she said quietly. Let him speak. George shot her a look of disbelief. Danielle, you don't owe him anything. I know, she replied, her voice steady. But I want to hear what he has to say. Stevens swallowed hard, his throat dry. For a moment he wasn't sure what to say. He hadn't expected her to give him this chance. And now that she had, he felt the weight of it pressing down on him. I'm sorry, Stevens stammered, his voice trembling. I didn't mean for this to go this far. I was just doing my job. Danielle's expression didn't change. Your job is to protect people, to serve the community. What you did to me tonight had nothing to do with your job. I thought Stevens began, but Danielle cut him off. No, you didn't think. You let your prejudice, your assumptions, dictate your actions. You saw me, a black woman, in a nice car, and you decided I didn't belong. You decided that I was guilty before you even asked a single question. And now you want to apologize? Stephen's face flushed with shame. I didn't mean. I don't care what you meant, Danielle said, her voice sharp. What matters is what you did. You arrested me without cause. You humiliated me in front of my husband, in front of your colleagues. And now you're going to pay for it." Stevens felt the ground give way beneath him. He had hoped, foolishly, that his apology might be enough to make things right. But he could see now that there was no going back. He had crossed a line, and there was no undoing what had been done. I don't want to lose my job," Stevens said quietly, his voice barely a whisper. Danielle's eyes hardened. "You should have thought about that before you put those handcuffs on me." Stevens stood there, frozen, as George stepped forward, his eyes blazing with fury. "You're done, Stevens. I'm going to make sure of that." Just then, Captain Hayes appeared in the doorway, his face etched with frustration. "Stevens, get out of here. Now." Stevens didn't move at first, still reeling from the finality of what had just been said. Then, slowly, he turned and walked out of the room, his steps heavy with the weight of his impending downfall. Now. As he disappeared down the hallway, George turned back to Danielle, his expression softening. "Are you okay?" Danielle nodded, though the truth was far more complicated than that. She was physically fine, but emotionally she was exhausted. The fight wasn't over. Not by a long shot. But for now she was free, and that was all that mattered. Danielle sat quietly, her hand resting in George's as they waited in the small room just off the station's main hall. The whirlwind of the past few hours still reverberated in her chest, but she maintained her calm exterior. Years of practicing law had taught her the value of patience, of staying composed even when chaos erupted around her. But tonight had been a test like no other. This wasn't a courtroom, this was her life, her dignity, and she had been dragged through the mud by a man with too much power and too little regard for her humanity. She looked up at George, whose face remained stoic, though she could feel the anger simmering beneath the surface. He had been quiet since Stevens left the room, but Danielle knew that inside, her husband was seething. George Harris didn't forgive easily, and Stevens had just crossed the last line. The door opened and Captain Hayes entered, his expression grim. He looked from Danielle to George, and then let out a deep sigh, the weight of the situation bearing down on him. He stepped further into the room, closing the door behind him, and sat down across from them. "I've spoken with Officer Stevens," Hayes began, his bite was heavy. "He's not handling this well, but I want to assure you that we're taking immediate action. He's been placed on administrative leave effective immediately, pending the outcome of our internal investigation." Danielle remained silent, her face unreadable, but George leaned forward, his voice cold and measured. "Administrative leave? That's it. Mr. Harris, I understand how this looks." "I don't think you do," George interrupted, his voice rising slightly. "My wife was falsely arrested, humiliated, and detained for no reason other than the color of her skin, and your solution is to put the man responsible for this on leave. How is that justice?" Hayes' jaw tightened. "This is just the first step. There will be a full investigation into Stevens' conduct, and if we find that he acted improperly, which, based on everything I've seen so far, is almost a certainty, he will be terminated." "That's not enough," George said, his voice low and dangerous. "You know it's not enough." Danielle shifted slightly in her seat, her gaze still locked on Hayes. "Captain Hayes," she said calmly, her voice firm. "This isn't just about one officer. It's about the system that allowed him to think he could do this in the first place. Stevens didn't act alone, he was emboldened by a culture that allows officers like him to abuse their power without consequence. He didn't think twice about putting those cuffs on me because he assumed the system would protect him, and it almost did." Hayes looked down at the table, clearly struggling to find the right words. "You're right, Mrs. Harris. There's a lot we need to fix in this department. And what happened tonight, it shouldn't have happened. I'm deeply sorry for what you've been through." Danielle's eyes flashed with intensity. Apologies aren't going to change what happened. What I want is accountability. Real accountability. Not just for Stevens, but for everyone in this department who thinks they can get away with this kind of behavior. George crossed his arms, nodding in agreement. My wife is right. This is bigger than Stevens. This department needs to send a message to him, to the public, to every officer who thinks they can operate outside the law. We're not just asking for Stevens to be fired. We're asking for systemic change. Hayes let out another sigh, his shoulders sagging under the weight of their words. I hear you, he said quietly. I do. And I agree there are deep issues that need to be addressed, but systemic change doesn't happen overnight. It's a process. George's eyes darkened. And in the meantime, what happens to the people who have to live in fear of men like Stevens? Hayes didn't have an answer for that, and the silence that followed was deafening. Danielle leaned forward slightly, her voice calm but unyielding. Captain, my husband and I have the resources, the connections, and the influence to make sure this doesn't get swept under the rug. If we have to take this to court, if we have to file lawsuits, we will. This can't just be another case of an officer getting a slap on the wrist and being sent on his way. We're prepared to fight. And Chinayug-san. Hayes looked between the two of them, the realization dawning on him that this wasn't going to go away, not this time. I understand, he said finally, and I want to work with you to make this right. George stared at him for a long moment before finally leaning back in his chair. Then start by making an example out of Stevens. Fire him. Make it clear that this kind of behavior won't tolerate it. And then let's talk about real reform. Hayes nodded slowly. I can do that. I'll start the process of terminating Stevens immediately. And I'll make sure this department begins addressing the broader issues. I don't want this to be another case of sweeping things under the rug. We need to make real changes. Danielle felt a small sense of relief, but it was tempered by the knowledge that this was just the beginning. The fight wasn't over, not by a long shot, but at least they had won this battle. Hayes stood, extending his hand to George. Thank you for bringing this to my attention, Mr. Harris and Mrs. Harris. Again, I'm truly sorry for what you've been through. I hope you'll give us the chance to make things right. George shook his hand, though the gesture was tense. We'll be watching. As Hayes left the room, the silence that followed was thick with unresolved tension. Danielle finally let out a long breath, leaning back in her chair as the weight of the night began to settle on her. You okay? George asked softly, turning to her. She nodded, though her expression remained somber. I will be. But we're not done, George. Not by a long shot. George's eyes softened as he took her hand in his. I know, but we made progress tonight. That's something. Danielle looked down at their intertwined hands, her mind already racing with thoughts of what came next. I want to make sure this doesn't just fade away, she said quietly. Stevens might be fired, but there are others like him. The system is still broken. We'll fix it, George said, his voice full of quiet resolve. One step at a time. Danielle nodded, but her heart was heavy. The road ahead was long, and the scars from tonight would take time to heal. But she wasn't the type to back down from a fight. She had spent her entire life fighting for justice, and this was no different. We'll fix it, she repeated, more to herself than to George. Together they stood and left the station, stepping out into the cool night air. The sky was still dark, the city quiet, but something had shifted. This wasn't the end, it was just the beginning of a much bigger battle, and Danielle Harris was ready for it. As Danielle and George walked out of the police station into the cool night air, the weight of the night's events hung heavily between them. The streetlights flickered overhead, casting long shadows on the pavement as they made their way to the car. Despite the small victory they had achieved in getting Officer Stevens placed administrative leave and the promise of his termination, there was a heaviness in Danielle's chest that refused to lift. George unlocked the car, holding the door open for Danielle as she slid into the passenger seat. He circled around to the driver's side and got in, but neither of them spoke immediately. The quiet inside the car was thick, filled with the unspoken truths of what had happened. Danielle stared out of the window, watching the empty street, her mind replaying every moment of the ordeal, every insult, every violation of her dignity. "We're not done," she finally said, her voice steady but laced with determination. George nodded, gripping the steering wheel. "No, we're not." It wasn't just about Stevens anymore. The entire system that had allowed him to act with such impunity was the real enemy now. Danielle knew that this was bigger than one man's abuse of power. This was about a culture of prejudice and injustice that had festered within the police department for years, maybe even decades. Stevens was just a symptom of a much deeper problem, one that would require far more than a single lawsuit to solve. "Do we have to go public with this?" Danielle said, turning to face George. "The story needs to be told. People need to know what happened. If we keep this quiet, it'll just get buried along with everything else." George sighed, running a hand through his hair. "I know, but going public comes with its own risks. You'll be in the spotlight. We'll both be targets." "I've been a target my whole life," Danielle replied, her eyes flashing with determination. "This isn't new for me. I won't let fear stop us from doing what's right." George looked at her, his expression softening with pride. He had always admired Danielle's strength, her unwavering commitment to justice, and now, more than ever, he knew she was right. This couldn't be swept under the rug. The only way to create real change was to shine a light on the darkness. "We'll need to get ahead of it," he said, his mind already working through the logistics. "We'll talk to the press. Tell them exactly what happened. Make sure they understand that this isn't just about one bad cop, it's about the whole system." Danielle nodded. "And we'll file a lawsuit, not just against Stevens, but against the department. We need to push for real reform. Body cams, bias training, accountability measures. This can't happen again." George leaned back in his seat, exhaling slowly. "It's going to be a long fight." Danielle's lips curved into a small, grim smile. "I've never been one to shy away from a long fight." They drove home in silence, the weight of what lay ahead pressing down on them both. But despite the uncertainty, Danielle felt a renewed sense of purpose. This wasn't just about getting justice for herself, this was about making sure no one else had to go through what she had endured. It was about changing the system, brick by brick, until it finally became one that worked for everyone. Over the next few weeks, things moved quickly. The press got hold of the story, and soon, Danielle's face was all over the news. Headlines screamed about the wrongful arrest, about Officer Stevens' misconduct, about the lawsuit that was now being filed against the department. It wasn't long before protests began, with people taking to the streets to demand accountability and justice, not just for Danielle, but for every person who had been wronged by a broken system. Captain Hayes, true to his word, moved swiftly to terminate Stevens, but it wasn't enough. The public wanted more, they wanted reform, real reform, and Danielle and George were at the center of it all, pushing the narrative, making sure that the conversation didn't fade away as it so often did. Danielle became a symbol of the fight against police misconduct. Her name was spoken in the same breath as other civil rights icons, and she found herself standing in front of crowds, giving speeches about the importance of justice, of equality, of the fight that still lay ahead. It wasn't the path she had expected for herself, but it was one she walked with pride. But even as the momentum built, Danielle knew the road ahead was long. Change didn't come easy, and for every victory they achieved, there would be setbacks. But she was ready for that. She had always been ready for that. For one evening, several months after the ordeal, Danielle and George sat together on the porch of their home, watching the sun set over the city. The lawsuit was still ongoing, the protests were still happening, and the fight was far from over. But for the first time in a long while, Danielle allowed herself a moment of peace. "You ever think about what would have happened if you hadn't called me that night?" George asked, his voice soft. Danielle looked at him, her expression thoughtful. "I try not to. I can't afford to dwell on the what-ifs." George nodded. "You did the right thing. You always do." Danielle smiled, squeezing his hand. "So did you." They sat in silence for a few more minutes, the quiet between them comfortable. The road ahead was still uncertain, but Danielle knew one thing for sure. As long as they stood together, they could face whatever came next. And they would. Gade. Gwyd.